Welcome to lesson 14. In this lesson, we're going to finish chapter 4, Choosing Understandable Names. Now for all the smallest programs, you'll probably need to use your editor or the IDE's Control F feature to find where your variables or functions are referenced in your code. If you choose a short generic variable name such as num or even something like a, you're going to end up getting a lot of false matches. To make the name easy to find immediately, you should form unique names by using longer variable names that contain specific details. Some IDEs will have refactoring features that can identify names based on how your program uses them. I have a guess the number program right here in PyCharm, and I can right-click on a variable and go to refactor and rename. And these refactoring features are really nice to have. For example, they can tell the difference between a local and a global variable that happen to have the same name. Those features are really useful, but you should still choose names as though these tools weren't available. Now, keeping this rule in mind will naturally help you pick more descriptive names instead of generic ones. The name email for a variable or a function is pretty vague, so consider something more descriptive like email address or download email attachment, or something like email message, or even reply to email address. These names are longer and they're more descriptive, and they're easier to find with a Control F find feature. Next, you want to avoid jokes, puns, and cultural references in your variable and function names. And I have a story about this. At one of my previous software jobs, our code base contained a function named gooseDownload. Now I had no idea what this meant because the product we were creating had nothing to do with birds or the downloading of birds. And so I found the more senior coworker who had originally written this function and given it this name, and he explained that goose was meant as a verb, as in goose the engine. Now, I had no idea what this phrase meant either, so he had to further explain that goose the engine was automotive jargon, and that meant press down on the gas pedal to make the engine go faster. Therefore, gooseDownload was a function to make downloads go faster. I nodded my head and went back to my desk, and years later, after this coworker had left the company, I renamed his function to increase download speed. Now, all of this is to say that when choosing names in your program, you might be tempted to use jokes or puns or cultural references that add some levity to your code, but don't do this. Jokes can be hard to convey in text, and the joke probably won't be as funny in the future. And puns can also be really easy to miss, and handling repeat bug reports from coworkers who confuse your pun for a typo can be quite punishing. Avoid culture-specific references, as these can get in the way of communicating your code's intent clearly. Now, the internet makes it easier than ever to share source code with strangers around the world, and they won't necessarily be fluent in English or understand English jokes. So as noted in previous lessons, the names spam, eggs, and bacon are used in the Python documentation, and these reference the Monty Python comedy sketch. But we use these as metasyntactic variable names. We never actually use them in real-world code, only in examples. Now, the best policy is to write your code in a way that a non-native English speaker can readily understand. You want it to be polite, direct, and humorless. Now, my former coworker might have thought that gooseDownload was a funny joke, but nothing kills a joke faster than having to explain it. Next, you don't want to overwrite built-in names. Now, Python has several built-in names for its functions, things like print or round. These are built-in names. Math is the name of a module in the Python standards library. But when you create your own variables, you don't want to reuse these either accidentally or on purpose. For example, it's really common for people to use list as a variable name. It can contain some list of values like this. However, list is already a name that's used for the list function. It converts values into lists. Now, if I overwrite this with my own value, and then try to use it in the original context, I've replaced the list function with this list value, and now code like this, that expects the standard list function to still be there, won't work. Now, to find out whether Python is already using a name, you can go ahead and type it in the interactive shell or try to import it. You'll get a name error or a module not found error if the name isn't being used. So, for example, open is a name that's being used. It's being used by the open function. And test is also a name that's already being used by the test module. However, if you wanted to use a name like spam, you're going to get a name error because Python isn't using this name already. So you can feel free to use this name in your code. You're not overwriting any of the built-in names. Or if you try to import eggs, you get a module not found error because eggs is not the name of an existing module. Now let's go over some commonly overwritten Python names. You don't have to sit down and memorize all of these, but it would help if you are at least somewhat aware of these. So those names are all, any, date, email, file, format, hash, ID, that's a really common one, input, also a really common one, list, min, max, object, open, random, set. This is really common when you have a set or get function, but remember, set is already a function in Python. Stir, sum, test, and type. You don't want to use these as variable or function names in your own code because Python already uses these names for its built-in names. Another common problem is naming your .py Python files with the same names as a third-party module. For example, I've installed the third-party module Paperclip that gives me a copy and paste to the clipboard function, and I can import it with Paperclip. And I can copy some text to the clipboard, and I can also read the text off of the clipboard with the paste function. However, what happens if I create my own file called paperclip.py? Let's go ahead and restart this. Now what happens if I try to import Paperclip? Python is going to look inside the folder of the current working directory and see if paperclip.py exists there, in which case it does. So now it's importing my blank paperclip.py file instead of the actual real third-party module named paperclip. And in that case, when I try to call the functions inside that module, I'm going to get an attribute error because it's going to say paperclip has no attribute paste because I haven't imported the real paperclip module. I've only imported this one, which is named paperclip.py, and there's no copy and paste function in this file. So be careful when you're naming your own .py files so that you don't use any names of the Python built-in standard library modules or any third-party modules that you've installed. Now let's go into the worst possible variable name you could ever use, and that name is data. You would never want to use a variable named data because data, this literally describes every variable. All variables contain data. This does nothing to describe the contents of this variable. You should absolutely never use that as a variable name. Another name that you should never use is var. This is really weird. It doesn't describe what the variable contains. It just says, yep, this is a variable. This is really terrible. It's sort of like if you had a pet dog and you named it dog. And finally, this is fairly common, but temp is also a variable name that you shouldn't use. This is often used for variables that temporarily hold data, but really from a Zen perspective, if you think about it, all variables are temporary. But not only that, sometimes this variable name is also used to mean temperature as well. So you really want to use something that is much more descriptive. And finally, if you need a variable to hold the statistical variance of your temperature data, please use a variable name that's descriptive, like temperature variance. What you should not use is the variable name tempvar data. Well, that wraps it up for Chapter 4 of the course textbook. In the next lesson, we're going to begin Chapter 5 and look into code smells.